Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. So I recently had a young construction professional approach me looking for advice as they consider their goals for 2025, and they were extremely thoughtful here. They had a budget, they had a timeline. Each one of the goals were SMART goals. They were specific and measurable and actionable and what's the other one? Results-oriented and time-specific, whatever. They were all broken down. I was really, really impressed. And their question was, this is my plan. A, am I missing anything? And how can I achieve these faster? So I started running through and a couple of the topics that they were interested in learning more about. I had some very specific podcast episodes that I had listened to on other platforms. I was going to recommend to them. And then I mentioned, hey, there's 3 books that come to mind immediately, and I think you could gain a lot from them. And it was at this point that there was kind of a screeching halt. And this individual informed me that they felt guilty about it, but they really don't like to read. And when they said really don't like to read, they meant I refuse to read. I really, really dislike the activity of reading. And at the risk of being annoying, I said, do you mind if I ask another question? How exactly do you read? And there's a pause, and then the answer was something similar to,
it's called reading. Top to bottom, left to right. Group words together as a sentence. Take Tylenol for any headaches. Midol for any cramps.
So this individual looked at me strangely and said, how else would I read? And I said, well, there's a number of different ways to read depending on your goals for the book. And they leaned in like I was absolutely crazy and said, what are you talking about? So I explained to them what I'm going to share with you now. And this individual said, I've listened to a ton of your podcasts, of this Construction Leadership Podcast. And I'm flattered and humbled. And I said, thank you. They said, why have you never mentioned this before? Because this could be really valuable. So I'm looking to rectify that now. So I started with the 3 big rules that I have for books. And the first rule is there is no relationship between when you buy a book or a book comes into your possession and when you read it. None. If you buy a book, it does not mean that you should feel pressure to read that book now. Maybe you got 3 books for Christmas. Doesn't mean that they should sit on your shelf and weigh on you at all. It is an asset. You can use it whenever you want. You should not feel pressure. You should not feel any guilt. Again, there's no relationship when you buy a book and when you read it, absolutely none. So that's rule number 1 I have. Number 2, you have full permission, at least for me anyway, to quit reading any book or any text at all. That could be an article on your phone or a magazine. You have full permission to quit reading it if you get bored with it. Do not let one book ruin your interest or love of reading. Super simple rule. If it bores you, throw it down on the floor, put it back on the shelf, whatever. Get rid of it. Now is not the time for you to read it. There's other good stuff to read. Just move on. And number 3, if people you admire, maybe these are people around you, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a sibling, whatever. If someone you admire and you know, or someone you don't know, maybe you're listening to, I bet I've bought 10 to 15 different books from people I don't know, but listening to them, I admire them on the Knowledge Project. Shane Parrish's podcast is wonderful. The guests he has on the show, if they say something like, this book changed my life, or I would strongly recommend this book, I don't overthink it. I just buy the book. Why? Because I admire them. Now it's something I have. And again, see rule number 1. I feel absolutely no pressure because there's absolutely no relationship between when I buy a book and when I'm supposed to read it. So this last one, if people you admire recommend a book, just buy it. This comes from Ryan Holiday. You may know him. I'm a big fan. I've not read all his books, but the vast majority of them. I am on 3 of his newsletters. So he has a book reading newsletter where he breaks down books he's read and makes recommendations there. He also has a daily Stoic one and also a daily dad newsletter, which when I say it like that, it sounds lame and boring. It's not. It's a good little reminder to not be an absentee father. And I call this the Ryan Holiday rule because this is the exact text that is at the bottom of every single one of his newsletter lists. It reads, I promised myself a long time ago that if I saw a book that interested me, I'd never let time or money or anything else prevent me from having it. And that's where I am. I buy a hell of a lot more books than I do read. A lot more books are coming in than they're going out. And I am 100% comfortable with it. And if I say to myself, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to read that book, I just buy it. And I firmly believe if I view this as an investment and the average book is, $15, I do not believe it's possible for me to overspend on books in a given year. I don't. And if I think of the other ways that I'm spending money poorly, it sure as hell isn't on books. So as I was explaining to this individual, before we even start talking about how to read a book and the different ways to do that to maximize this ratio between time spent reading and insights gathered, it's really important we think about those 3 rules. And again, no relationship between when you buy a book and when you read it. Number 2, you have full permission to quit reading if it's boring. And number 3, if people you admire recommend a book, just buy it. So with that foundation set, I then broke down the 4 different ways that I read a book. The first one I call a story sprint. This is generally when I am looking for more information. More recently, it's more context, more details around a story that I'm already aware of. And I am literally rifling through the pages. I'm not perusing in the sense that I'm kind of glancing through. I'm not. I'm giving each page 4 or 5 seconds. I'm just trying to look at anything that might capture my attention. The most recent example of this, I heard the story about P.T. Barnum and I wanted to learn more. He wrote a book a long time ago in the early 20th century and I bought it. And it's like 450 pages. It's way too big and it is poorly written. Maybe it was written well at that time, like 110 years ago. It is poorly written for today's reader. It was obnoxious. So I immediately went into story sprint mode and I'm just like flipping through. About 150 pages in, I find the details around the story that I was looking for. I took what I wanted from it and I shut the book and I threw it off to the side. And at this point in time, I do not believe I will ever return to it. Now, I don't know. But again, that's the point of having an asset. Maybe I will. Right now, I'm sure as hell not planning on it. So that's the first one. That's called your story sprint, just blown through the book. The second one is called breaking the book. This is when you are reading the beginning to understand the argument the author is making. Then you skip all the way to the end and you read the end. So how do they present the argument at the beginning and how do they wrap it up? How do they conclude to kind of bring all the pieces together? And when you do that, you get a pretty good idea of what the book is about. And then and only then you determine how much time, if any, you want to spend in the middle portion of that book. A recent example of this was Dr. Carla Fowler I had on the show. She was a wonderful guest, and she recommended a couple times this book called The Formula, subtitle, The Universal Laws of Success. I kind of rolled my eyes at the whole thing, the title, the subtitle, and I thought, I'm pretty sure I own like 7 other books that are like this. Do I really need another one? So I bought it. It was written by a guy with a very funny name I've never heard before, Albert Laszlo Barabisi. So I went back to rule number 3. Someone I admire, Dr. Carla Fowler, recommended this book to me. Therefore, I bought it, but I took this break the book mindset to it. I read the beginning, I read the end, was pretty impressed. Then I went back, and now I'm nearly done with the entire thing, and it is a great book. I really enjoyed it. It has changed the way that I think, specifically around social media. So I would recommend that book, but I wasn't committed to just run through it from beginning to end and giving every page and every sentence like a lot of attention, which is the third way to read the book. I just call this the slow roll. You might just call this the way I was taught to read, which is kind of the David Spade and Tommy Boy, Richard Hayden approach. Top to bottom, left to right, and you're just kind of reading everything in order. So that's the third one. And that brings me to the fourth way. I call this the double dip. This is when you buy the book and you read the book when, for me, I am generally at home during the day or in the evening. And when I'm on the road or I'm at the gym through the AirPods, I will listen to the same book in Audible. and I will generally listen ahead. You can listen faster. And then I will come back and I will get caught up on the page and I'll go back and forth. And what's fascinating to me, and I realize this is an incredibly nerdy thing to think about, it's an entirely different experience. The things that jump out to you and I will highlight like on the page in the book versus what you hear are often very, very different. And I'm doing that right now. And actually a book that I read before called Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock and some guy Gardner, Dan Gardner, maybe. And the reason I'm doing that is we have a new app coming out in January of 2025. We're going to make it free. If you are interested in thinking about your own thinking and making predictions of what you think are going to happen on events that are in your life that you care about, you can email me and you can join. We're going to get a small group in addition to this MBA class I'm teaching. It's going to be a requirement for those individuals to go do this. The whole idea is let's quit relying on outside experts and start figuring out if our own predictions are any good. And if they are, let's do more of that. And if they're not, how can we learn faster? But anyway, I digress. My point is that book, Super Forecasting, I realize we're going to be spending a lot of time with that. I'm going to be working on it with clients and friends. There's a lot of money and time that have gone into the development of this app. I need to revisit this. That kind of sparked my interest. Therefore, I am doing the double dip. I'm reading it again as I'm listening to it. And again, I've really enjoyed this experience. It's going to help me, and I believe it's going to help the app do better. So again, that is the story sprint. You're just kind of blowing and going, looking for anything that catches your attention. Then break the book, read the beginning, read the end, and then determine how much of the middle you want to go read. Number 3 is the slow roll, or just reading. And the last one is the double dip, where you're reading it and listening to it at the same time. So when I got done explaining this to this individual, I was able to make 3 of the book recommendations. This individual agreed that they would go and read them, but each one of them, I kind of prescribed a different way to approach the book, to experiment with it and see how it goes. And there's nothing saying that this will work, but this is why we have rule number 2. If any of these books bore the individual, they have the full permission to put it down and move on. And I believe with this person's work ethic and the way that they think, they're going to be able to get value out of these books. And maybe they're not going to fall in love with books, but they will be able to view them as an asset that can help them achieve their goals faster. And my overriding recommendation to this individual and everyone else is don't make reading such a precious activity. Take what you need and move on. If you got a book and it's not resonating with you, then put it down. Or if you have a book and the first 50 pages are amazing and then pages 60 to 65 are boring, put it down, move on. You can always come back to it. It's something you own. And again, rule number 1, there's no relationship between when you buy a book and when you read it. But I firmly believe if you can find a style of book and you can identify the best books in that genre or on that topic, and you can start working through them, you can absolutely speed your development to achieve your goals faster. And it sure as hell is a lot cheaper than spending 4 or maybe even 7 years in college.
Did you hear I finally graduated?
Yeah, in just a shade under a decade, too. All right.
You know, a lot of people go to college for 7 years.
I know. They're called doctors.
So that's it, my friends. Hopefully you found some value in this and you can think differently about acquiring more tools and knowledge around you that will help you make 2025 an amazing year. As always, thank you for listening. And if you have any book recommendations that you think I should read or our listeners should read, don't hesitate to email me directly. It's just Bradley at Bradley Hartman & Co. As always, thank you for listening. We'll close out like we always do. You, my friend, are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.